Hello and welcome to Ahval Podcasts, the home of objective, up-to-date, independent reporting on Turkey. Don't forget to follow our reports through social media, on ahvalnews.com or through our mobile app. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to Talking Turkey, a podcast of Ahval News. I'm Ahval editor David Lepeska, and joining me today is Wladimir van Wilgenberg, a freelance journalist based in Erbil, Iraq, who writes mainly about Kurdish issues and co-authored a book released in August, The Kurds of Northern Syria. Hello, Wladimir, and welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So I'm sure you've heard the big news that started late Sunday night after a phone call between U.S. President Donald Trump and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the White House announcing that U.S. troops would be pulling out of northeast Syria and allowing Turkish forces to move in. We are speaking on Wednesday morning when reports from Turkish, American, and Syrian Kurdish officials suggest that Turkey will launch a military offensive into northeast Syria, perhaps in the coming hours. Your book looks closely at the Kurdish autonomous experience in Rojava, an administrative region that stretches, I think, from the Euphrates River to the tip of the peninsula or Jazeera area in the northeast. First, for our listeners, we're going to be using some acronyms in this discussion. So if you could just please explain to me the links and differences between the Democratic Union Party, or PYD, which I believe oversees Rojava, and the two main militias we hear about in this region, the People's Protection Units, or YPG, and the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF.
Well, of course, the PYD was created in 2003. And then the YPG was created basically when the Syrian civil war started in 2011. And then later the SDF was created after the Battle of Kobani was finished, when the US first started supporting the Syrian Kurds against ISIS. So official force now, it's called the Syrian Democratic Forces. So it's called the Syrian Democratic Forces. When inside the Syrian Democratic Forces, you have the YPG. To use like the PYD for that, it's useless because PYD is a political party. It's not an armed movement.
Right.
So the only thing you have is
I get it. So if we say SDF, we're also including the YPG.
Yeah, you also include the
Got
YPG.
it. Okay, thank you. So my first question is about what we might be losing if Turkey does indeed destroy Syrian Kurdish autonomy in this region. Liberal-minded Western media has often held up Rojava as a model of democratic governance, particularly as it is staunchly secular and it champions feminist ideals. Your book examines the institutions and organizations of Rojava, and I think it found that while political participation has increased, there are also some significant shortcomings. Overall, did you find Rojava to be a model governance system?
Well, it's comparing to what you compare it to. If you compare it to the rule of the Turkish-controlled areas, for instance, like in Bab or Azaz, or if you compare it to the Syrian regime, of course, it's the model they have. It's like a model for all of Syria. If you compare to that, if you compare to Holland or Germany, of course, it's not like a model. Like some people have claimed that, okay, it's like an inspiring model, for instance, more for even for Europe, like that goes too far. But for the region itself, it's quite we did like surveys, and like a lot of people, they talked about how important is, for instance, the women's rights in that area. I mean, that's like a sort of revolutionary concept that they're trying to ban, for instance, polygamy and underage marriage, and also that they're trying to bring this to Arab majority areas, although they didn't ban it there, for instance, because they don't want to have like a tribal revolt. So like what I wanted to say, like basically is that, yeah, that's basically what I would suggest. Like, it depends on what you compare it to, and like I don't think it's just a thing of the Western liberal media or something. I mean, the media in general, they just describe the things to make it more understandable for a general public. So that's why you get this kind of conceptions, and this book is like academic research. So that's the difference.
So yeah, as I said, Turkish military is preparing to launch an incursion into this area, and Turkey's policy objective in northern Syria seems to be to eliminate any SDF political entity in the region, or PYD, as you say, which suggests that Ankara won't be satisfied with a limited incursion to control areas along the border, as analysts have begun to suggest that it might be. Is it your expectation that this will soon be an all-out war, as the FDF has vowed it would be in the face of Turkish aggression?
Well, it depends on, of course, if Turkey, it seems that it's still difficult to say where Turkey attacks. If, for instance, Turkey attacks a specific area, like a small territory, and not not the whole border, then of course it will be different. But even if Turkey attacks a small area, then the SDF will be forced to bring all the forces and attack that area. So, like, it really doesn't matter much, like, what will happen. There will be a very dangerous situation and an all-out war on the border. So it's difficult to say until basically Turkey try to invade this area. But nevertheless, it's going to be very bloody, and it's going to be a disaster for, like, Western policy in the area.
Yeah, in Europe and the US, the main reaction to the US pullout has been that this is a stunning betrayal of the Syrian Kurds, particularly the SDF, which played this key role in defeating ISIS. Is that the sense there among the Syrian Kurds, do you think?
Well, the thing is, for the Syrian Kurds, is that like before basically the Trump's phone call with Erdogan, like, there were promises by the US that Turkey will not attack because they have the security mechanism deal. So according to the security mechanism deal, they would, like, carry out joint Turkish US patrols in the air, but also on the ground. And the Kurds, they would remove, like, heavy weapons and fortifications. So the Kurds, they were committed to that. They didn't expect suddenly to Trump to say in a statement like, okay, let Turkey attack, and this is like a tribal war. This is like hundreds years of war between Kurds and Turks, and we don't want to be involved in this. And I tried 3 years to stop this, and now I just say, okay, let's just let them sort it out among themselves. I mean, they didn't expect such a statement.
So basically, they've been doubly betrayed by their partner, the U.S., and then by allowing, as per an agreement, to destroy their fortifications and remove their heavy weapons. So now that you write in the book, actually, that U.S. support boosted Syrian Kurdish agency and confidence and security, and without it, they're exposed. But now, without these fortifications and heavy weapons, it seems they're even more exposed, doubly exposed to Turkish offensive.
Yeah, I mean, they started, like a lot of these fortifications, they started to create them when Trump last year said he's going to withdraw. But then basically there was a lot of pressure on him, and he changed his policy. And then in August, finally there was this agreement between Turkey and the US, and basically the SDF was part of it. But of course it was like a direct agreement between the US and Turkey, and then the SDF committed to that agreement. So that was like the situation, what we are in now, so that they basically removed their own protection to show a sign of goodwill to the US and also to Turkey, but now they will be attacked.
Do you think that maybe the Syrian Kurds here didn't always completely trust the United States? I mean, they have this long history of betrayal that's led to this saying, no friends but the mountains.
Well, like, even despite of the security mechanism, there were certain leaders are saying, like, despite of that, we take the threat of Turkey very serious, because even during the security deal, there were still, like, threats from Erdogan, and there were talks about sending 2 to 3 million Syrians to the northeast of Syria, from which the majority is not from the area, and these kind of issues. So, like, at the same time, they also said, like, we don't know for sure. There could still be any point, there could still be a Turkish attack. So they were not, like, completely naive, but at the same time, they were thought that, like, the US was committed to supporting the SDF.
Right. Some have predicted now that without this US support, the SDF will turn to Assad for protection. Have you heard any rumblings about that? And how might that play out if that happens?
Well, of course, it would not be very surprising, because they also did that last year when Trump threatened to withdraw, and there was already an interview with Maslum Kobani, the SDF commander-in-chief, that he was saying that possibly one of the options they have was basically to work with Assad to fight against Turkey. So it's possible that they will try to reach some form of agreement with Damascus and most likely with Russia to basically put either forces on the border or, for instance, to give some certain territories to the Syrian regime so that they can focus on fighting Turkey. So there's all kind of scenarios possible, but always the problem was that like the Syrian government and Russia, they didn't accept the Syrian Kurds or the SDF to have any autonomy or self-rule or to keep like this sort of system intact. So that will be like very difficult also for the SDF or the Syrian Kurds to do, because it will be like a bitter pill to basically give so much concessions. But if they are faced with like either a Turkish occupation and a similar scenario what earlier happened in Afrin, yeah, maybe they will have like a hard choice to make. But I mean, officials in the past said they rather have like the Syrian government rather than Turkey occupying them. So yeah, it's like a very difficult situation. So there's a possibility of that, yes.
And you haven't heard any talk of that in the last few days since all this happened?
There have been officials saying that it is an option on the table, but it's until now there's not a very clear sign of such and like
no movement in that direction yet.
No movement in that direction, apart from that there was some signs that maybe already Manbij or Russians were already pushing for trying to enter the city, and also there were like some social media propaganda suggesting that the Russians were preparing sort of like a bridge to enter Deir ez-Zor's countryside.
Some analysts have said that a significant Turkish military assault on the SDF could spark a renewed insurgency by the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, back in Turkey, which could push Turkish forces into a longer and more complex cross-border conflict. Just to point out, Turkey, of course, sees the SDF as an extension of the PKK, which is labeled a terrorist group by Turkey, the US, and the EU. So in some sense, a deep Turkish incursion would put that theory to the test. If the PKK does indeed renew its insurgency, it would seem to prove, to some extent, Turkey's view. What, in your view, is the depth of the connection between the SDF and the PKK?
Well, I mean, we keep talking about that, but I think it's not relevant to talk about that. So if you want, you can ask that to someone else, because I really don't want to talk about that question. It's just useless to everybody. Every time I talk to about that question. Also, it's like pure speculation if the PKK would do something. I mean, the PKK already fought inside Turkey after the breakdown of the peace process, and they lost many cities to the Turkish army. I mean, they're quite like under-resourced at the moment, because they lost those battles for the cities in the southeast when they tried to actually control cities and try to create self-rule in those areas, in, for instance, areas like Nusaybin, but also in parts of Diyarbakir and other areas. And like the whole cities, they were basically sort of leveled. Some parts of these cities, they were leveled to the ground, and they lost a lot of fighters. So I think it would be quite difficult that PKK would do such a thing if they, for instance, like launch an insurgency again. But of course, we don't know what is exactly going to happen. I mean, despite even if Turkey attacks or not, I mean, there's already daily fighting between PKK and Turkey anyway. So it's not like renewing.
Most observers agree that the YPG was the key fighting force in defeating ISIS. And now that Turkey is said to be taking over responsibility for keeping a lid on ISIS, taking control of these ISIS detainees in the Northeast, which number something around 30,000 or 40,000, analysts say. Some people fear this could lead to an ISIS resurgence. And just this morning, there have been some signs. New York Times columnist Rukmini Callimachi and a couple others have said in tweets that Kurd officials in Rojava are reporting that ISIS fighters have launched a coordinated attack to take Raqqa. Have you heard anything about this? And what might that mean if true?
Well, there was an attack, like an attempt to surround the headquarters of the internal security forces, and there were like some suicide bombers that attacked that specific area. I mean,
just today, just yesterday?
Well, it was basically a few hours ago. I mean, okay. It was not very long ago. And basically, it just happened after the SDF, and also when Turkish officials confirmed that there will probably most likely be in 24 hours, there will be like a conflict between Turkey and the SDF. So it's not very surprising, because ISIS is always trying to take advantage of conflict between other countries and actors. We have seen this during the whole fight against ISIS. We've also seen that they have tried to benefit, for instance, between fighting between Syrian opposition groups and the Syrian state. They always try to benefit from security vacuums, let's say, in the past. And also they have done it in Turkey by constantly attacking Kurdish activists, for instance, inside Turkey, attack peace rallies. They also wanted to break down the peace process between the PKK and the Turkish state.
So you're saying this is probably ISIS already taking advantage of a possible conflict between Turkey and Syrian Kurds before it even began?
Yeah, and it's possible that ISIS is going to try that more, that when, for instance, when the SDF is under attack by Turkey, there's a very high risk that, for instance, that ISIS, they already have like carried out a lot of sleeper cell attacks since the fall of the so-called caliphate in March. They have already been carrying out a lot of sleeper cells, especially in areas like Deir ez-Zor, but also in Raqqa and Manbij, and even in Hasaka, and in a few cases in Qamishli. So if, for instance, Turkey attacks the SDF, there's also a very high likelihood that ISIS will start to carry out large-scale attacks on the SDF. For instance, in Deir ez-Zor and also in Raqqa, the SDF will withdraw large forces to protect the border. So they are also under-resourced there now, and they don't have the same support of the US-led coalition as in the past, because they allow basically Turkey to attack. So that's like a very big danger now for the SDF, is that while they also have to fight Turkey at the same time, there will probably be attempts, for instance, from ISIS to try to break the prisons and try to release ISIS prisoners by creating prison breaks, or, for instance, trying to send forces to the refugee camp. You have, for instance, Al-Hol camp. I mean, there have been attempts in the past for ISIS women also to escape, for instance, the refugee camps where all the women and children are. And I think there was also one time even an attempt by ISIS from outside of the camp, basically to try to free women from one of those camps. So it will be very difficult for the SDF. They will be dealing with attempted people like ISIS trying to release the SDF prisoners. And also, for instance, the woman, and at the same time, like large attacks, for instance, especially in the areas where they have to remove forces to fight Turkey. There can even be a possibility that ISIS will try to take territory, basically.
So we're already seeing the results of, it seems like we're already seeing the results of SDF shifting forces to the north along the border to fight Turkey and leaving areas where there's greater ISIS presence exposed. Kind of, we're already seeing the results of that, you're saying. And so what did you hear the outcome of this ISIS attack this morning? Did anything happen? Did it take this center, this base it attacked?
Well, in the end, the attack was repelled, and like the fighters that attacked, they were mostly killed. Like I think they were all killed. Okay. That's what the latest thing I heard, is that basically the attack was repelled, and there was also a statement by the Raqqa's security authorities. So that was it. But there's a possibility that we're gonna see more of this kind of attacks, like even in, for instance, in cities in Manbij, in the countryside of Deir ez-Zor especially, and also in Raqqa.
This just underscores the difficulty of Erdogan's plan to clear out the Kurds and move up to 2 million Syrian refugees from Turkey into this planned safe zone area. Ankara insists this would not be demographic engineering, but analysts in the last few days have saying that Trump's pullout of American forces has cleared the way for ethnic cleansing, and some point to what happened at Afrin. Are these concerns warranted? What do the Syrian Kurds view of all this?
Well, I mean, everybody knows that the majority of the Syrians in Turkey, they are from northwestern Syria. They are not from the northeast. There are even statistics about this, but I mean, maybe a quarter or more or less, like basically you could say like a minority of those Syrian refugees are from the northeast. So if, for instance, Turkey puts like 2 to 3 million Syrians in these areas, like you have like, especially the Kurdish presence is largely on the border, like in towns like, for instance, Kobani, you have Darik, you have Amuda, you have other towns, like all these towns are on the border. And if, for instance, Turkey launches operations, these places get depopulated because those Kurds, they will flee. And then Turkey comes and puts their like Syrians from other areas from Syria, mostly from Aleppo and Idlib and other areas, in these houses of these Kurds. Then it will be basically ethnic cleansing, because this was exactly what happened in Afrin when there was sort of a basically de facto deal between Russia and Turkey. So Turkey allowed the regime to take some small points in Idlib. They make like some concessions to the Russians. And in exchange for that, like there were large numbers of Syrians that came from the south of Syria, basically, and they were placed basically in Afrin. So that's why now, for instance, you have one group, it's called Jaish al-Islam. They're originally from Ghouta. They came to Afrin with all their families, and they are now basically in Kurdish homes. So what happened, like a lot of fighters from basically from areas that were defeated by the Syrian government, by the Syrian regime, they were moved by through an agreement through Afrin, and now they were setting up bases and basically taking houses from Kurdish residents that fled, or they were forcibly displaced even. So that's like the fear that they have, because if you look now, for instance, that the groups that also are gathering on the border, like almost none of them are, for instance, there are no, I mean, you could say there's almost no Kurds among those forces. So that's, especially for the Kurds, there's this fear. Also the Christians, they fear this, because you have also pockets of Christian communities on the borders, like there's thousands of Christians living on the border.
I spoke yesterday to former Turkish Foreign Minister Yashar Yakush, and he told me that being a Kurd should not be reason enough to be expelled from this area, because we do not know who supports the YPG. But your sense is that all Kurds will just flee the border areas if Turkey begins an incursion, just out of fear, whether they support the opposing force or not?
Well, it depends on the scale of the battle. Of course, first of all, they will flee the fighting itself. But also we've seen in Afrin that despite the Turkey always say it's against the YPG, it's against the PKK, like in the end, like we have seen in Afrin that it was like all Kurds were basically targeted, like even the Kurds that stayed in Afrin. There's several reports from the UN, for instance, from the UN Commission, the UN Commission of Inquiry on Syria. There's other reports also from Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and others. There are also some other NGOs. They release reports in Afrin that basically the population is basically sort of used by rebels to get money from them. They are being kidnapped for ransom, and they are taken hostage. So like any Kurd, like they have seen what happened in Afrin. They are not like stupid. They know what is going to happen. I mean, I've also saw like a statement from one official from, not from the PYD, but from the other side, who was saying on his personal Facebook, saying, no, we should stay. We should not, we should not leave. Like what happened when Afrin was invaded, we should also stay in our homes. We should not leave their homes because we'll lose everything. But it's, of course, if Turkey attacks with tanks and all these large, heavy weapons, I mean, these people are not going to stay. They will try to flee somewhere. I don't know. There's also, Turkey have not stated until now if they would, for instance, open the border for people so they can first flee the area. We haven't seen anything yet.
Turkey's not going to destroy the entirety of these cities, presumably. It's not going to be like 2015, 2016 in Southeast Turkey, when the city centers were under attack, because that's where all the militants were hiding out, were in fortifications. I think one assumes that there will be a certain limited battles, and then Turkish forces will take over these areas, and some of the people will be able to stay because they won't be amid battle. So I guess my question is, so if it does happen that way, and Kurds, as this one Syrian Kurd argued, as you said, if many of the Syrian Kurds did decide to stay, what do you think would happen in that case? How do you think Turkish forces in Turkey would respond to that, a significant remaining presence of Kurds?
Well, I think there will be significant destruction, but it depends on the order of the battle. For instance, in Afrin, basically the YPG decided to withdraw because they didn't want the city to be destroyed. Like Turkey keeps saying that it was because of Turkey city was not destroyed. Of course, that's not true, because we've seen what happened in the southeast when, for instance, the Kurds decided to fight an urban battle and like all those cities were destroyed. But
Right.
Turkey said this is not a problem anyway, because they said we're going to rebuild it, we're going to reconstruct this area, we're going to build thousands of houses there, and probably Europe has to pay for that, according to the Turkish view. So that's the view of Turkey. But apart from that, as your other question, basically what we see is that you have this these areas that, of course, if Kurds, there will be Kurds attempting to stay there, but it's very dangerous for them because we have seen what Turkish-backed groups did in Afrin. So they could be victim of kidnapping, they could be victim of arrest, arbitrary arrest. So the situation for those Kurds that remain in the area will be very, very difficult. But it's also very difficult to say until now where most likely the Turkish attack will be first in a small area, but it could also be, of course, that it will be expanded to a larger area. So we have to first see if this Turkish incursion will be limited to a specific area like Ras Al Ain and Tel Abyad, or this incursion will be in larger areas, that it will also be in other Kurdish cities or areas, for instance, with Christian population, because it's still not clear until now, at least for me, that, I mean, it seems that it's going to be a limited incursion, as you said, but it could also be larger, because for the Turkey and for Erdogan, it's like the most important thing to establish as much as facts on the ground before he has this meeting with Trump in November. So it would be logical for Turkey to take as much as territory as possible in this very small time frame.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Any last things you'd like to say, perhaps on behalf of the Syrian Kurds, where you've spent so much time in recent years as Turkey prepares to launch a perhaps large-scale military incursion?
Well, I cannot say anything on behalf of the Syrian Kurds, but I mean, this situation is very critical. There's going to be most likely large refugee flows, and it's going to affect the whole region. So we have to see how this will play out. But it's like a threat. It's going to lead to an empowerment of Iran and Russia, resurgence of ISIS, most likely large refugee flows to the Kurdistan region of Iraq. So the situation is quite critical if Trump doesn't basically change his decision. But until now, we haven't seen much. But what is very interesting, that the official account of the U.S. Special Operations Command, I think what they called on Twitter, basically put a SDF with a hashtag on it on their Twitter. So there seems that there's still a lot of people in the U.S. military on the ground in Syria that are still sympathizing with the SDF.
Oh, yeah, that's it. One last question I want to ask about that. What do you think is the view in northeast Syria among the Syrian Kurds of this kind of waffling and policy ambivalence from the U.S.? I mean, on Tuesday, Trump vowed that the U.S. had not abandoned the Kurds, and said that the U.S. was still supplying financing and weapons, and again vowed to destroy Turkey's economy.
Yeah, I think, for instance, there was such a good relationship between the U.S. Army and the Kurds and the SDF in general. So, I mean, they don't blame the U.S. military for this decision. They blame basically Trump. They blame the White House for this decision. So that's why there was always a very good relation actually between the U.S. military on the ground, and they basically blame Trump and the White House for this decision. So you saw also a statement, I think, from the SDF that they thanked the U.S. people and the U.S. public, and they asked them, to put more pressure on the president. So that's the situation with that. So, I mean, they basically blame Trump for not being committed to the deals that were made, but they don't, for instance, blame the U.S. Army or the U.S. soldiers on the ground. And despite of all the fact, that was also the same in 2018, for instance, when Trump had a similar statement, but a little bit different, but a similar statement. Then U.S. soldiers were also afraid that the SDF would not protect them or something, that they would be angry. But at that time, they still protected them. They said, look, this is not your decision. You are just soldiers on the ground. You carry out your orders. And we have fought bravely together against ISIS. We're still going to protect you. You don't have to worry that we're going to be angry and do something against you. So that's like this nature of this relationship on the ground. Like that's why there's this very strong relation between the U.S. Army and the SDF, and you don't see this in other areas of the Middle East where you always had like the U.S. training certain forces for counterterrorism operations, and then, for instance, those forces suddenly shooting or carrying out attacks. For instance, we've seen in Afghanistan how many times that local Afghan forces basically starting to shoot or trying to kill U.S. soldiers on training bases, but you never had this with the SDF. So that's like a very interesting dynamic that basically developed. And that's also very different from, for instance, what you have with the U.S. Army that's still in Europe, because you see, for instance, the European Central Command is still very pro-NATO and very pro-Turkey, but you see actually from the U.S. forces on the ground that they become like so much pro-SDF because it was like a very good partnership between the both forces. And that's why they even Washington tried to bring in the European Central Command as a sort of middle mediator between Turkey and the US Central Command, which is a very weird but interesting dynamic.
It's interesting. So there's torn loyalties on both sides. The Americans kind of support Turkey and NATO as they're supposed to because of the alliance, and they also support the SDF because they've been their key fighter against ISIS. And then on the SDF side, they trust the US, who's partnered with them for years, but they don't trust the leader of the United States, who has repeatedly vowed to withdraw troops and is now doing so.
Yeah, that's exactly, I guess that you could summarize it like that, yeah.
Wow, that's interesting. Okay, yeah, Wladimir, thanks so much for your time. Once again, so people know, the book is called The Kurds of Northern Syria. It came out in August. Yeah, thanks for your time and insight.
You're welcome.
Thanks, have a good day.